I mix what I like, what I like, what I like, what I like, what I like. Good evening, everybody.
Good evening.
Well, given that wonderful introduction, I think we should just go ahead and get started. This is a powerhouse book. If you have not gotten and have not read it, it's a must purchase. It's a must read. So first of all, congratulations on the work.
Thank you so much.
Let me start with that. As we were talking earlier, let me just start by asking you to lay out for us, from your perspective as the author, why this book and why now?
Thank you so much. Pleasure to be in conversation with you, Dr. Ball. Thank you, Politics and Pros. Thank you for those who are in attendance. I really appreciate seeing your countenance. Again, my name is Wendell Nii Laryea Adjetey. To my kinsmen and kinswomen on the African continent and throughout the African diaspora, I'm also known as Nii Laryea Osabu the First. And first and foremost, I must give recognition to the Creator, indeed to the God of my ancestors, to the covenant of my ancestors. Osabu, Osabu Latel, Gidi Gidi, Begbete Bete, Katamanso Tache, Gambiache, Tuntache, Bochukwombo Nyaga, Nunko Nunko. And I give thanks to the spirits of my ancestors, Atriko, Wesisaji, Nyancho. To Dr. Ball's initial question, why this book and why now? So I had the immense pleasure of being my father's son, and my father, only having a 7th grade education, is nonetheless an exceptionally bright and brilliant African man. And growing up at my father's feet, I had the fortune of learning about the history of African peoples who were scattered to the four winds. And this early education of mine, in addition to growing up in a place like Canada, and especially in a cosmopolitan city like Toronto, where I grew up with friends, but also elders who were ethnically African American or African Canadian or African Caribbean, I was able to gain a much deeper appreciation for what African peoples have endured, their freedom struggles, how they forged connections across borders, how they saw themselves as a single unit in order to resist systems of anti-Black domination, exploitation, and of course, oftentimes extermination. And so this book, in very simple ways, is about Black self-identification, it's about Black self-assertion, it's about Black self-determination over the course of the long 20th century. So literally starting in 1900 and ending in the year 2000. And this particular moment in history is very noteworthy, especially when we understand and we can appreciate that so many of the freedom struggles, revolutionary struggles, and even day-to-day ways of resisting white domination had been in some ways subverted with deadly precision. And to understand how those forms of counter-subversion or counter-insurgent or counter-revolutionary measures that were deployed against African peoples to such proficiency. And so I envisioned a book that would not only pay homage to elders and ancestors long gone who imagined something meaningful, something revolutionary, something life-giving to African peoples and also their descendants, but also something that could serve as a meaningful reminder / blueprint. And this is one of the profound lessons I learned as a little boy sitting on my father's feet, that history is a blueprint for African peoples. To understand your history is to chart a path towards liberation.
Right on. Thank you. Right out the gate, one of the first things you reading in the acknowledgments of the book, you have a self-referential line about where you are coming from, and you refer to yourself as coming out of a neo-colonial background. There's any number of ways you could have phrased that, talking about coming out of Ghana, et cetera, and so forth. Why is that, and how does that phrase or that terminology represent the work itself? Why is that the approach? Or yeah. Does that make sense? Yeah.
Absolutely. Okay. Excellent question. Excellent provocation. And to be very candid with you and very sincere, I wanted to signal to my readers and to signal to other historians that I am through and through a product of the African masses, the African proletariat class, regular men and women who have fought, who have imagined, who have resisted forms of exploitation, subordination, subjugation, not only on the African continent, but certainly throughout the African diaspora. And so when I reference that I am a product of the Ghanaian/African neo-colonial subjugated class, I am not being hyperbolic at all. I was born in a slum in like a very serious hood in Ghana in West Africa. So was my father, my mother. My parents have a 7th grade education, to which I've alluded already. That certainly would have been my fate had circumstances not changed in a very drastic way. And so I am not your typical historian. I'm certainly not your typical Yale PhD. I'm certainly not your typical academic. And so I bring something that in some ways is unbridled. There's a certain authentic experience that I have. There's a certain ethic with which I've been inculcated. There's a certain sacred knowledge in terms of who we are as African peoples on the continent and also in the diaspora. And so all of those experiences, those identities certainly shape my outlook as a historian. And sometimes that, oftentimes in fact, it helps me appreciate and see things in the historical record that my counterparts don't see.
So, again, you do a lot with this book, and you tell a lot of stories, or tell several stories of different women and men to make several points throughout the book. So, obviously, you can pick from the many examples that you work from in the book to answer this question, but I do want to ask this question as soon as possible. I admit that. Let me try to phrase it, get the phrasing exactly right. Given what you say about the importance of pan-Africanism, the relationship of Africans here in the United States, on the continent, in the Caribbean, and particularly going throughout North America into Canada, given what you have to say and the clear importance that it holds for your work, and given what you also have to say in the book about various state repressive responses to those efforts, is it fair to say, so in other words, based on what you have written here, is it fair to say that you've produced a scholarly account which supports the following assertion? Being opposed to Pan-Africanism in the 21st century is tantamount to being an agent of state repression, or is at least behavior indicative of, or of the de facto practice of, or the de facto practice of state repression?
That is a plausible assertion.
Okay.
It is a plausible assertion to make, in the sense that Pan-Africanism, when it is pursued as an objective that can truly transform the material conditions of African peoples throughout the African world, is by far the most effective form of resistance against anti-Black exploitation, anti-Black domination, anti-Black extermination. And in the book, in my introduction, I make a very clear statement that the greatest act of Pan-Africanism in the modern world, at least in the context of the Atlantic world, going back to Saint-Domingue, or what some of you might know as Haiti or Haiti, the revolutionary struggle that enslaved Africans initiated in Haiti from August 1791 to December 1803 was the greatest and most successful form of human revolutionary act against any form of tyranny. And this was the first time in human history that a group of enslaved peoples, or a servile class, had overthrown their captors and their enslavers and created a free republic, a free country. And Africans did this, right? They overthrew the French, they resisted the British. And of course, this history is a major reason why Haiti has the various feet of the imperial powers on its neck. And so we see that when African peoples subordinate their, what Michael Gomez calls their tribal marks, so their ethnic identifiers, subordinate class, they subordinate gender, they subordinate other religion, other identities that might divide them, and they can work together as a common front. There's no foe that can resist that form of revolutionary struggle. And so this is also why Pan-Africanism, when it is deployed and it is pursued in this genuine sense, often receives pushback, very serious pushback from the various Western powers. On the other hand, and we also know as scholars that there are flippant notions of Pan-Africanism. There are bourgeois notions of Pan-Africanism. There are outright neo-colonial notions of Pan-Africanism. And it is those forms of Pan-Africanism, sadly, that have infiltrated the minds of commentators who are not so sophisticated, right? And therefore, when they express forms of disdain towards Pan-Africanism or this Pan-African project, they're often alluding to those forms of neo-colonial Pan-Africanism. And so in that instance, I am sympathetic to working poor African peoples, regardless of where they are, who are skeptical of Pan-Africanism because of how elites have counter-subverted this very revolutionary idea.
No, right on. And I mean, you do talk a little bit about the different forms of Pan-Africanism and allude to various figures throughout history and their various practices of it. And you even say something very interesting about the Du Bois-Garvey dynamic that reminded me of something that Paula Giddings said once about Du Bois, if I'm paraphrasing her correctly. She said something to the effect that because her real point was that Ida B. Wells was really the original grassroots black radical leader who was omitted largely because she was a woman. And that Du Bois, much like other men, Frederick Douglass, I think she was lofted to that position in part because he was a man, but that in part because he had a closer connection to white activists and eventually scholars who have kept his name. Not that he's not deserving, and I think he's often done wrong too in terms of his radicalism being undermined and all that. But you say something. If I heard it and read it similar, that you were saying something similar. That Du Bois versus Garvey, you used the phrase or the term messianic. I think right. You were saying Du Bois didn't have that appeal to the people, to the black community, in the way that he had hoped to. And then you even say something, I think referencing David Levering Lewis, that I don't remember. So I was a little bit, that Du Bois, like you were saying, I'm going to use a young person's term, he was thirsty for that leadership. You were saying that he had it in his mind that he was, I think you used the predestined.
Yes.
Okay, so say a little bit about all of that, if you would, what you're trying to convey in terms of Du Bois and Garvey and some of the others maybe that you want to mention.
Absolutely. Firstly, regarding the ancestor Ida B. Wells, a phenomenal organizer, probably the greatest investigative journalist that we have ever known. And also, she was a very influential and important member of Marcus Garvey's Universal Negro Improvement Association. Garvey had so much faith in her investigative journalistic practices that he tapped her and A. Philip Randolph as the UNIA's delegates in 1919 to attend the Paris Peace Conference. And of course, Du Bois was also attending the Paris Peace Conference, and he worked with the State Department to undermine the UNIA's delegation.
Which is what I was thinking when you talk about his disconnect with the people. It's like, well, maybe that's because you keep working with the...
Exactly, absolutely. So that's definitely a part of it. And not to take anything away from Du Bois is one of our greatest thinkers and arguably probably the greatest mind, regardless of color, gender, etc., in the last 500 years in the Atlantic world, right? He is a giant of an intellectual. But there are certain things that one cannot acquire from a Harvard PhD or a Yale PhD or any other sort of elite training. And that is a genuine connection to the masses. And Garvey, who was born as part of sort of the Jamaican peasantry, and Garvey is black as pitch. He is 5'5", he is stout, he's pugilistic. But Garvey arrives from Jamaica to the United States in March 23rd, 1916. And this Jamaican man with an invariably Jamaican accent is able to electrify the African American masses, because there's something that you cannot take away from someone who has a genuine and authentic connection to their peoples. And this is what Du Bois lacked. And so Du Bois' own biographer discerned that Du Bois perceived himself, and I'm quoting Du Bois' biographer, Du Bois perceived himself as the avatar of the race. That's right. He perceived himself as the Black Christ, and he often wrote about the Black Christ, right? A Black messianic figure. And Du Bois could not attract a messianic following because he couldn't speak in a manner, he couldn't convey ideas in a particular manner that would bring hope to the Negro masses, to sharecroppers, right? To regular folk who are being terrorized in the Deep South, who are being bombed out of their communities in East St. Louis and Chicago, in Philadelphia, and Washington, D.C., and New York City, etc., etc. Garvey had that. He had it in droves, notwithstanding the fact that he was ethnically Jamaican and not ethnically African American. And so these nuances in terms of how the masses perceive potential leaders and those who can help galvanize the peoples is very important, because you can't fabricate authenticity, you can't fabricate sincerity when it comes to leadership and Pan-Africanism.
My bad. Something's been throwing me off, and I know what. I've just figured out what it is. It's that Milton Friedman Capitalism and Freedom book is in my eye line. It's messing up. It's disturbing my psyche and my. Good God. Yeah, get it. I just play. It's right. It's right. I'm just messing with it. I couldn't help. I kept looking at it. I was like, oh my God, my eyes are burning. Get this guy out of here. Yeah, there you go. Thank you. All right, there you go. All right. Right. But that is actually, I mean, I was joking a little bit, but not that much. It is, that the project, that neo-colonial project, or what he would have called neoliberal project, of using capital to destroy liberation all over the world, is something that you, as I said back off stage or whatever, before, and I want to say it publicly, as someone who is in the academy and as someone who is sensitive to how a lot of us are mistreated in the public sphere. I really appreciate that you have written a very academic, scholarly book, but that is clearly targeting a working class revolutionary consciousness, at least as I read it. You can correct me if I'm misinterpreting it. And that, as I said earlier, it's an academic support or a scholarly support for, or offers scholarly support for this idea that attacks on Pan-Africanism are state, if not sponsored, encouraged, that there's a clear political will among those in power to disunify African people. So the Cold War factors as somewhat a prominent theme in the book, and I wanted you to talk a little bit about the relationship of the Cold War to the Pan-African struggle, because I think you're both saying there was an attempt to destroy Pan-Africanism, but also to misuse it through infiltration, counterinsurgency, et cetera. So could you talk a little bit about the context of the Cold War and as you discuss Pan-Africanism?
Certainly. So the Cold War plays an important role, a very significant role over the course of this text. And in the post-war period, and certainly after the U.S. national security and intelligence apparatus had effectively decapitated the Black Power movement, many of the Black activists, revolutionaries had either been assassinated, and this is not a conspiracy theory. We know through the COINTELPRO records, and certainly we know as a result of high-profile assassinations of the late, great Fred Hampton and so many others, and even bigger names than Fred Hampton, that the U.S. federal government did not want the rise of a Negro Messiah, and assassination was one means to eliminate the rise of a Negro Messiah. And so after the civil rights movement, with the rise of Black Power and the Black Panther Party in Oakland and its sort of dispersal throughout the country and even beyond the United States, we see African American activists, men and women, recalibrate their strategies towards liberation. And this recalibration meant that they were acutely aware of state repression and the various forms of state sabotage and infiltration. And so they effectively triangulate their power. They triangulate Black power in the Atlantic world. So the North American mainland, principally Canada and the United States, constituted one node of this triangle, or one vertex of this triangle. Another node was the Caribbean basin, and then the third node was Southern Africa, where there were revolutionary struggles, of course, in Angola, in Mozambique, in Guinea-Bissau, in Rhodesia, etc., etc. And certainly South Africa, apartheid South Africa. And so what happens is that Black activists, Black revolutionaries are sharing ideas in terms of how to resist sort of a global white supremacy. They're sharing ideas on how to assert the rights of African peoples in this bipolar world, and also navigating notions of strategic bipolarity and non-alignment. But they are also providing very sophisticated and direct action support to aid the revolutionary struggles in Southern Africa, based on principally to help oust Portugal, which was more or less the last remaining colonial presence in Southern Africa, on the African continent. And so the CIA effectively mapped out this triangulation and created its own triangle to counter-subvert this Black Power, Pan-African revolutionary movement in the Atlantic world. And so, and I spell this out in very clear detail, and it's not conjecture. I actually applied and filed for endless documents through FOIA, through the National Archives here, but also in Canada as well. And the declassified intelligence documents that I received, often quite redacted, but sometimes incredibly eye-opening, revealed the extent to which the CIA, with support from a US-Canadian weapons manufacturer, with support from intelligence operatives who had been deployed to infiltrate Black radical and revolutionary movements, how they were basically subverting a global Black Power in the Atlantic world. And so I go into very specific details in the book, especially in chapter 6. I don't want to say too much now in the interest of time, but it is a phenomenal story that has never been told. And to see the ways that literally the empire emulated what Black revolutionaries were doing to undermine revolutionary Pan-Africanism.
And that's exactly what I want to ask about next. And just to co-sign your point, I mean, again, not that it matters, but I don't just do praise for the sake of praise. Like, the book is very well done. It's very thorough. There's a lot to it. We're barely scratching the surface, I can't imagine how much anyone could do in an hour talking about the book, given all that you've done here. But to that last point, because you bring up my man Sam Greenlee.
I do indeed.
And you say something in there that I can't front is a little disturbing to me. So I'm going to ask the question this way. Given what you had to say using the Greenlee spook who sat by the door example, what does it mean to produce radical art, journalism, or scholarship if the state can just turn around and turn it into training manuals?
Brilliant question.
Because that was spooky. Pun intended.
Yes, pun intended, indeed. So Sam Greenlee wrote a classical text, which was later adapted into film, The Spook Who Sat by the Door. And this novel portrayed an African-American Uncle Tom figure who pretended to be an Uncle Tom to infiltrate the CIA. And once he entered the bowels of the empire and learned the art of counterinsurgency, warfare, etc., he left the CIA and basically went back to inner city Chicago and turned gangbangers into constructive community organizers and defenders of their community and taught them everything that the agency taught him. Long story short, Greenlee wrote a novel that inspired the hearts and minds of African peoples in this country and beyond. And this book, The Spook Who Sat by the Door, was so threatening to J. Edgar Hoover's FBI. It was so threatening because in many ways it augured or it foreshadowed what the Negro masses, quote-unquote Negro masses, were capable of achieving, and certainly the creativity behind this novel. And so the FBI basically conspired with Hollywood to ban viewings and showings of this revolutionary film. The FBI also incorporated the book in its training manual on counterinsurgency. Now, remember, this is post Malcolm's assassination, 65, King's assassination, 68, urban rebellions, black folk just discharging centuries of frustration, of racial terror, of exploitation, economic disenfranchisement into the streets. And so the FBI did not have the capacity and did not have what they call predictive intelligence, meaning they didn't have snitches in the hood who could snitch on their own communities, right, and undermine their own communities and infiltrate organizations. And so the FBI looked at this manual, and there's a fabulous book entitled FB, so the initials, eyes, as in, right, eyes, looking at how the FBI had a long history of reading the works of radical authors, right, and basically understanding how to incorporate the ideas of radical individuals into its counterinsurgency work. And so, long story short, the FBI used this book in its training manuals on the art of counterinsurgency in the American inner city or inner cities. And one of the individuals whose counterinsurgent work that I go into specific detail, and again, based off of declassified materials that I received here and in Canada, this individual is named Warren Hart. He founded the Baltimore chapter of the Black Panther Party. He just unleashed hell on the entire Eastern Seaboard because he was its defense captain, infiltrated Stokely Carmichael, Kwame Ture's organization. The FBI and the Canadian government conspired to send him to Canada. He did the exact same thing there. He was sent to the Caribbean, did the exact same thing there. And so this notion of the empire incorporating ideas that are meant to liberate and transform the material conditions of African peoples in turn being used against them to keep them in a place of subordination, a place of quasi-bondage and exploitation, is very real. And we see the after effects of it.
Yeah, backing up just a little bit, you talk about some of the concern that, because you talk about the post-World War I Red Summer, right? Bloody, what am I? I'm
Red Summer.
Red Summer,
Yes.
right? And you said something in there that I thought was interesting, that Woodrow Wilson feared that black soldiers coming back would represent Bolshevism. Could you just say a word or two about that time period and how that factors into what you were doing overall in the book? Because I thought that was particularly interesting as well.
Certainly. So Dr. Ball is referring to Chapter 1, which is entitled The Messianic Moment. And the Messianic Moment was from 1919 to 1931. At least that's how I periodize it. And it's, in essence, a resurgence from what the great historian, African-American historian named Rayford Logan called the nadir. So Rayford Logan, who taught at Howard for a few decades, he described the post-Reconstruction period, so 1876, 1877 to the turn of the century, around 1901. Rayford Logan called that the nadir. Nadir is Arabic for like the low point, right? So this is like the lowest point of race relations in the United States. And so I describe the Messianic moment as a resurgent moment where African Americans no longer play this game of turning the other cheek, right? They actually knuckle up and fight back. And they fight back in very audacious ways. Right here in the city, I literally start the book with a quote-unquote race riot, or what was an anti-black terrorist campaign by white mobs, literally steps away from the Capitol and the White House. And there's an eyewitness, a black eyewitness, who relayed the bloodshed, which was equal parts black, equal parts white, related to the Negro press at the time, the radical socialist African-American press. And so this era was a time when black folk are standing up. It's the era of the new Negro. As I noted, they've knuckled up, they're fighting back. And Woodrow Wilson, during his presidency, of course, Wilson being exceptionally anti-black and exceptionally racist, he could not imagine that African Americans could, of their own volition, and certainly people are inspired by all types of global events because these are cosmopolitan people. They're not parochial, even if they're sharecroppers. They know about things that are happening in Europe, things that are happening in Asia and Africa and the Caribbean. But Woodrow Wilson insisted that the African American masses will be radicalized because of black soldiers who have fought in Europe and they've learned about Bolshevism, right? So the Bolshevik Revolution in 1917 in Russia, which was sort of this daring socialist experiment, revolutionary socialist experiment. And so Wilson is fear-mongering as president that black soldiers returning from war are going to turn other African Americans into Bolsheviks or into vectors of Red Scare, right, of communism. And incidentally, I quote a black doctor who was part of the founding members of the Universal Negro Improvement Association, the biggest Pan-African movement in the world, also in 1919, as I noted, in Toronto. And this doctor, when they were taking minutes, said that, as black folk, as African peoples, we must rely on ourselves because everyone else is practicing ethno-racial nationalism, right? They're relying on their strengths, right? So European Jews are relying on their strengths. Poles are relying on their strengths. Ukrainians, Asians, right? Everyone is relying on their collective strength to improve their lot in North America. And so black African people should do the same. And incidentally, he said we should display a type of courage like the Bolsheviks as well, right? And this is really important, but it tells us something about how black folk see the world, see themselves in relation to the world and what's happening in global politics and geopolitics, right? And great power rivalries. That they're not just receptors of information, but that they're actually very sophisticated cosmopolitan actors who look at the world in terms of the post-World War I period, in terms of colonialism, in terms of the League of Nations, and they see certain revolutionary struggles and they say, this looks familiar because it is a movement to liberate ordinary peoples.
Right on. So as we get ready to move towards audience questions, let me just ask one more. Without spoiling the way you end the book, you from the way I interpret it, you make a very important point that reflects back to something you say earlier in the book about two people that I would love to hear you say something about now. You talk about a 1-year period between the assassination of Malcolm X and the deposing at the behest and at the request and at the assistance of the CIA of Kwame Nkrumah in Ghana. Could you talk a little bit about what you're saying about that moment for the Pan-African world?
Indeed, excellent provocation. So, if my math is correct, I believe in 1960, Patrice Lumumba. Yes, Patrice Lumumba is assassinated by death squads, effectively trained by the CIA, supported by Belgian officials. Lumumba might have been 36, around thereabouts. So, I mean, I'm 37 years old, right? Imagine this African man leading the most mineral-rich country or territory in the known world. And he was brilliant, and he had a heart for his people, for African peoples, for pan-Africanism. So he's assassinated in 1960, and it sends a shockwave throughout the African world. But it certainly wasn't the last audacious form of counterinsurgency against revolutionary Pan-Africanism. So in 65, of course, Malcolm Omowale X is assassinated in New York City in front of 4 of his baby girls, in front of his wife, his pregnant wife, who is pregnant with twin girls as well, shot in his face, in his torso, for the whole world to see. And this is February 1965, February 21st, 1965. Exactly 1 year later, the CIA, in collaboration with neocolonial elements and counter-revolutionary elements in Ghana, in West Africa, in the country of my birth, staged the overthrow of Kwame Nkrumah. So in 65, Malcolm represented the heart, the mind, the pulse of the black masses in the Americas. Without a doubt, no one had that type of cachet like Malcolm did. In 1966, Nkrumah represented that same entity on the African continent, certainly throughout the African world. And the fact that their assassination / overthrow coincided perfectly tells us the significance to which the Western intelligence apparatus applied to these two individual men.
Right on. All right. We got about just over, 15 so minutes. Does anybody have any comments, questions, queries, conundrums, catechisms, cacophony, calumny, consternation, contemplation? You got the book for me. You might as well go first. Right on. Thank you.
And I also just got your book, and thank you very much. My question will not be informed and probably not coherent, but I appreciated what you were saying about Pan-Africanism and sort of the false presentations of it. Could you please tell us what your understanding of authentic Pan-Africanism is and some criticisms of how those others lack and are deceptive?
Excellent question, sir. What's your name?
Terry.
Terry. Thank you so much, Terry. So, authentic Pan-Africanism and a neo-colonial form of Pan-Africanism. First, authentic Pan-Africanism. Authentic Pan-Africanism inherently is revolutionary. And when I say revolution, or I invoke revolution, this is not inherently something that has to be violent, or it has to be a process rooted in bloodletting. No. Revolutionary in terms of providing the most exploited, the most subordinated and subjugated classes a sense of dignity, material security, right? And providing a redistribution of resources that invariably belong to the masses, right? And not in the hands of a few chosen families or clans. And so revolutionary Pan-Africanism, authentic Pan-Africanism, liberates the masses, right? It inspires hope among the masses. It does precisely what Garvey was able to trigger in the hearts of ordinary black men and women in this country, of different shades, of different religious backgrounds, different classes, etc., etc. But it inspires something that is deeply, deeply human, that restores the dignity, it restores the pride, it restores the fidelity of African peoples, especially African peoples who have been disinherited, dispossessed, dehumanized in the Atlantic world. The faux Pan-Africanism is hyper-capitalistic, it's exploitative, it's kente cloth, kneeling in Congress. It is the neo-colonial heads of African states who tell our beloved kindred across the Atlantic, in Canada, and the United States, and the Caribbean, and Latin America, this is the year of return. African brothers and sisters, come home, when there's nothing sincere about it. It's actually just a gimmick to bring tourist dollars to Ghana or Nigeria or other parts of the African continent. So the faux Pan-Africanism plays on the consciousness and sometimes even the yearning of African peoples to connect with their continent, but it is rooted in exploitation. The genuine and sincere Pan-Africanism is actually rooted in a liberation strategy and a liberation ethos that goes back several centuries.
And if I could just add, as an adherent of Nkrumah Tureism, I like Kwame Nkrumah's definition. Pan-Africanism is United States of Africa under scientific socialism. So, just
Indeed.
One other way of,
Indeed. And it was Garvey, actually, this Jamaican immigrant, who gave us this concept of the United States of Africa. And this is why Garvey was framed on trumped-up charges, spent over 2 years in the joint, in the penitentiary in Atlanta, and then deported back to Jamaica. The United States of Africa, rooted in sort of a socialist ethos, right? That the masses of African peoples would own industries, that they would own the material resources, it would benefit them, it would transform the African continent so that a United States of Africa would have its own diplomatic corps, its own military, its own navy, its own air force, to protect the interests of African peoples. And Malcolm, of course, as a product of Garveyites and Pan-Africanists, said that until Africa is free, until Africa and the African continent is united and has a sense of dignity and respect in the world, African Americans will continue to be lynched in the streets, whether by police or by vigilantes or whomever, and no one will call and come to save the people.
Good thing none of that's relevant today, though, so we're sorry. Anybody else? Comments, questions, queries, conundrums, catechism?
Yes, sir. There's a mic here for you.
Okay. How do you do mic?
And your name, please.
My name is Imani Africa.
Imani Africa. Welcome,
nice
brother.
to meet you both.
Right on.
Thank you for writing the book. I'm looking forward to, we just bought it, but looking forward to you signing it. There are so many questions, and thank you that you asked the first question I have, your definition of Pan-Africanism. Second, what do you envision of a movement, or not a movement, but a trajectory of Black people into this Pan-Africanism that needs to exist. How do you see that manifesting or not? Another one, I had the fortune of being at Brother Touré's funeral back in Harlem. One, I'm sure you had many, but one in Harlem with Farrakhan and so many others in that presence. It was just amazing. I had a chance to hear him speak at the United African Movement meeting several times, but he was just phenomenal. And even this illness, he was just phenomenal. Just wanted to hear those questions, where you see we're going. I'm looking forward to the book to get a more in-depth understanding of what you're saying. But thank you for writing, and thank you for this.
Thank you so much.
We'll see you sometime in the future.
Yes, sir. Thank you so much, Brother Imani Africa. So, regarding the first part of your question, how do I see Pan-Africanism coming into being in this contemporary moment? First and foremost, this is a process that must start in terms of consciousness. So, a racial consciousness of sorts. It has to be an awakening of the mind. And once the mind is awakened, that has that type of consciousness and that type of awareness must be channeled constructively into a process of organization. And Garvey often said the greatest weapon deployed against the Negro was disorganization of African peoples. Right? When a people are organized, they are effective. It is very hard to exploit people who are organized, meaning ordinary men and women and children working together for a common cause, a greater cause of their liberation. And so from race consciousness to political education, which means the process of putting what we know to the ground, right? And organizing our numbers, organizing our strengths, having a shared objective, a shared vision for the future, etc., etc. And at that stage, and one thing that Professor Ball and I neglected to omit is that the process of Pan-Africanism, the objective has to be a nationalist one. There has to be sort of a movement towards, as he noted, actually he didn't omit it, he did remember. So there has to be a movement towards marshaling the energies and the resources of African peoples towards free and sovereign African states that serve the interests of African peoples, the masses, not the interests of Western corporations, not the interests of a few elite families and robber barons, etc., but towards the interest of legitimate states, and certainly, hopefully, one day, a continent that is an African continent that is borderless, that is comprised of various states within a confederation or United States of Africa. This is not an impossible project, but it's certainly one that will require a great deal of work and a great deal of commitment. And it's certainly one that will inspire backlash or counter-subversion at every turn. And in terms of the great and late Kwame Ture, what a brilliant mind, and what a great contributor to the cause of African freedom. And there is no deception when you read Kwame Ture, when you listen to Kwame Ture, when you ruminate on the essence of Kwame Ture, that this was truly an African person who aspired to bring a semblance of dignity and respect and standing to all African peoples.
And still bothering folks, as evidenced when Bill Clinton called him out at John Lewis's funeral service. He couldn't help himself. He said, "Thank you, John Lewis, for not being Stokely Carmichael's baby." I was like, yeah, good God. This man been gone for how many years? He's still scared of that man. Yeah, good. Anyway, anybody else? Thoughts, comments, queries, conundrums? Yeah, go ahead.
How you doing?
Yes, brother. How you doing? Your name, please.
Charles Brooks.
Charles Brooks. Welcome, brother.
I appreciate this work, and I'm really looking forward to reading your book. I have a couple of questions. One question that I do have is, what is your expected takeaway of the readers? What do you expect the readers to take away after reading your book? And my second question is, how long did it take for you to do this work? And what surprised you the most in doing your research, in what you were able to unearth and uncover in doing this work?
Excellent. Thank you so much. And it's Charles Brooks.
Yes, sir.
Thank you so much, brother. So, the first question, you had to remind me again real quickly.
What do you
Takeaway.
expect
The
to take away?
takeaway.
Takeaway, yes. Excellent question. So, I learned again as a little boy growing up at my father's feet, that history is not merely academic, that history must have a constructive element to it. History must have a liberatory element to it. History must serve as a roadmap, and it certainly must serve as a blueprint. And especially for African peoples who have been disinherited in so many ways. We have been stripped of the God of our ancestors. We've been stripped of our ancestral tongue, of our practices, our customs, our ways of life, etc., etc. History restores something that is very profound, right? Something that is on the level of the divine. And so I would ideally like readers, and especially those of African descent, but not exclusively, but I would like readers to take away this point that history is not merely academic, right? That there's something of a blueprint that is embedded within, and we must have discerning eyes to see, because not everything can be said and not everything can be spelled out. Secondly, in terms of the project itself and completion time, so I was born in Accra, grew up in Toronto, moved to the United States, to Connecticut, to New Haven in 2012 to start my doctorate. And so the course of my doctorate, that was 6 years, completed doctorate, and then did a postdoc, and then started a faculty position at McGill University. So from 2012 to 2022, a decade's worth of work. And I had no idea I thought doing a PhD was hard, and then I had to revise everything that I'd written, revamp it, and then write an actual book. And and during the course of the pandemic, and life changes, and becoming a father, and all types of demands, etc., etc., it was one of the hardest things I've ever had to do, and it whipped my butt. But I'm still standing, still knuckling up when I have to.
Yes, sir.
And then lastly, to your third question, in terms of
what surprised you the most? What knocked you off your feet when you like, oh man? I'm sure there was a lot.
There were a lot of things, but especially chapters 5 and 6. Chapters 5 and 6. The level, those two chapters, I literally went into a depression after I completed the manuscript, because it is not easy to ruminate on the things of the past, and especially the things of the African past, and knowing that those past things are living in various ways, right? Living legacies of it. And so I've spent, I grew up in parts of Toronto where there's high gang activity. I went to took my undergraduate degree at the University of Toronto, and then did my MA right after at the University of Toronto. And my siblings and I are the first in our family to go to high school and get a high school education, let alone university. And so, coming from my class background, university was not in the cards at all, at least on the surface. But I give thanks to the ancestors, and that was a possibility. So I then left the academy and was working gang intervention. And the weird thing is, I was working with friends, working with peers, working with family members, young brothers who were around my age, like 23, 24, who were banging in the streets, spent time already, not just going to jail or doing a couple months. They'd spend hard time, maximum security prisons in Ontario, 3-4 years for serious offenses, etc., weapons offenses, drug offenses. And so I was working gang intervention, and one of the catalysts for me to return to school and get a PhD was I knew that what I was seeing in the streets and the level of mayhem and the ways that so many of our sons have been indoctrinated to despise themselves, to despise their image, right? And to terrorize one another, and effectively to terrorize the communities. And I've lost friends in the streets. And so something told me, my intuition told me that there's more to the story, even sort of a material analysis. There's more to the story than what we're seeing, right? Certainly this probably goes really deep. So I ended up doing my doctorate at Yale, and it was over the course of writing my dissertation, certainly the book, and getting access to these classified intelligence reports, where I discovered that the type of gang activity that we see in Chicago, that we see in parts of LA, certainly parts of this sort of metropolitan corridor, that we see in different parts of the South, we certainly see in Canada, and we see in the Caribbean, that type of gang activity and gunplay can be directly linked to the counterinsurgent forces of the late 1960s and early 1970s.
Yeah, I've read the introduction and went straight to chapters 5 and 6. Then the conclusion then came back to the beginning, and which is because I saw just in the titles and the breakdown of the table of contents, I was like, this is about to be heavy. It's about to get serious. And so please, everybody, look, as we wrap up here, a big congratulations to you for this work. Thank you for doing the work, and everybody, get yourself a copy and come get it signed. You know. Anyway.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ball.
Right on. Anytime. And thanks, everybody. Thanks to Politics and Prose for the space. And, support the book. Right on.
Thank you.
Thanks again, everybody, for attending. Join me in giving another round of applause.
Right on. Congratulations.
As mentioned, we have copies of the book.